Shalom. Have I got some word for you today, Israel? You know, I was speaking with a brother, it was just yesterday, about the schedule of the festivals this year and upcoming. And as I've shared with a few people, that I've begun to keep the priestly calendar, or the Zadokite calendar, which is mentioned in Scripture, that was confirmed through 6 years of scheduling in the Essenes, just as David had ordered the priest to stand in the holy place of Yahweh Elohim. So, anyway, I was talking about it, and as I was explaining to this brother, the whole topic, the whole subject of the festival days revolves around the issue of circumcision. And now, I just want to let this out, that a lot of people take a lot of views on the subject of circumcision. We know that Abraham was the first one called in uncircumcision. And because he obeyed Yah, his uncircumcision was counted for circumcision because he believed, which is synonymous in the Hebrew to be synonymous with obedience. Okay? So the covenant was given to Abraham, and he circumcised himself and his whole house. This is not Torah yet. I know a lot of people like to drag first mentions into Torah, and these are primitive, or I should say pre-existent conditions that laid the foundation for the law of Moshe, and so they're very solid as a reference point, because Abraham was called the father of faith. One title, he was called the father of faith. It's an interesting title, that one man. And he was also called the friend of Yah, or the friend of God. Okay? And that is very important, because it didn't say he was called a friend of God. Even Moses didn't get that title. Now, Moses received his own accolades from the Most High, obviously. But Abraham was called the friend of Yah, okay? And it was because he basically obeyed Yah in all things. He didn't add mixture. He didn't create new inventions. He didn't exercise elements of pragmatism to see if his life could fit and mesh somewhat, can't we all get along with the law or the commands of Yah. So anyway, I wanted to touch this because this is something I spoke with my brother yesterday, and it's interesting. When we go to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:19, he makes a very bold declaration. Now, there are a lot of Christian mechanizations around what this actually means, what it entails, but I'm just going to go ahead and read it briefly. 1 Corinthians 7:19 says that for neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but the keeping of the commandments of Yah is what matters. So, circumcision, keeping the commandments of Yah, is what matters. Uncircumcision, keeping the commandments of Yah, is what matters. Now, what I want to say here briefly is that it's not a polemic to do away with the Torah that on the 8th day every male child shall be circumcised. We're not dispensing and doing away with that, folks. Okay? What we're doing is we're trying to figure out, what is Paul referring to? What is he drawn upon back in the dark recesses of Israelite history? Okay? What is he drawn from? And he can only be drawn from one thing. And that is, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to Genesis 15 because it all has to revolve around the covenants. And there isn't just one covenant. There are many covenants. But the primary foundational one that we're speaking of here today is that Abraham made a covenant with Yah, or I should say Yah made a covenant with Abraham. He told Abraham what to do to get, all the animals and birds that were clean, and that he was to divide them into two, but not the birds. He was to lay them before me. And he commanded Abraham at that sacrifice, before he offered it by fire, and actually it was Yah who passed through the midst of the pieces and burnt that offering himself, showing that he had accepted his own covenant with Abraham, and that it was sure, and it was promised, and it was promising, and it was going to be a covenant forever. Unto your seed, unto you and your seed after you will I give you this land. Okay? So Yah passed through that covenant, passed through those pieces, barit, which means to cut, okay? And he accepted the offering that Abraham had prepared, which he had instructed for him to prepare. So when he did that, there was a prophecy that was given to Abraham, and he says, know of a certainty that your seed after you shall dwell in a land 400 years that is not theirs. And we're talking about Mitzrayim. Now, a long time elapsed from between the time this covenant was given and the time that Jacob, the patriarchs, went down and dwelt in Egypt. Okay? All right? And while they were in Egypt, Yah was working on behalf of Israel, and he was going to bring them out. Josephus, 210 years, and I think Philo was 215 years. It wasn't 400 years they were in Egypt. It was 400 years from the time, or 430 years it came out to be, from the time that he gave the prophecy to Abraham until they left the house of Pharaoh and went into the wilderness to serve their Elohim. Okay? Now, one of the things I want to mention is when they were circumcised, just like when we're circumcised, we are circumcised to keep a covenant, an agreement, okay? All right? And what happens there is that you are circumcised, which means you are actually pledging your flesh, your soul, and your spirit to keeping Yah's way, to keeping his covenant, okay? And that is what circumcision is, because Paul's drawing upon this event that happened later in the wilderness when he said, for circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments of Yah. Now, what I want to point out with the baseline of Abraham's offering and the prophecy that was given to him by Yahweh himself was that all of his sons in a perpetual covenant would be circumcised. He circumcised his whole house. He circumcised his sons, and then circumcised himself and his servants. And then he went and circumcised himself. Now, I've only known one man in my life, and his name was Ernest Weiner. That was my dad. And if I could be liberal with the saying, he was my spiritual dad. Okay? The man lived and breathed Torah for over 40 years. Maybe not to the liking or to the approval of other people, but I'm telling you, this man had tenure, and that man was a man, and he was a man of Yah. I don't care what anybody says. That man was a man of Yah. Okay? And so what Paul is saying, and then he says that if you don't keep the commandments, that your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Okay? Let's fast forward to the wilderness. Aaron made a nice golden calf for them to worship. The people started getting drunk, and they were, doing all kinds of, abominable acts, party hardy, Probably didn't know where their tent was. Probably didn't know who their wives was. We have that problem today, don't we? In Israel. So, anyway, so they broke the covenant that Yah had given them, and Moses had to break the commandments, meaning that you're not even worthy to receive these laws, because you said, yeah, these things we will do, and you didn't do them. And these were the circumcised people who said that. It wasn't the uncircumcised, because we're going to get to that. Okay? It was the circumcision of the third generation of people, of the men of war. Notice it doesn't say women, that all died in the wilderness. I'm sure many of them did over that span of 40 years, being that the average lifespan for a woman was about 42 years. Okay? There's some outliers. Some people live to be 50, 60, 70. But just like today, everybody's dying all over the age spectrum. It wasn't any different than that. But the average age of the people that lived in the late Bronze Age for females was about 42 years, and for males it was about 45 years, okay? And most of that was because of no dental care, and they were grinding their corn and their barley with stones, and bits of stones would come off in their bread, and they would break a tooth on it. And everybody knows that periodontal disease, and I don't think they had an American Dental Association back then, is one of the leading causes of disease in people. Okay? All right? So, now that we got that out of the way, Israel's circumcision became uncircumcision. And we have to understand that. We have to understand that because there is an event in Joshua chapter 5 that takes place later where it says that in the men who died, the men of war who died during those 40 years were all circumcised. They came out. It specifically says they came out of Egypt or Mitzrayim circumcised, okay? But then all of a sudden, Joshua's circumcising these fourth generation people that were born in the wilderness during these 40 years. He's circumcising them, and it almost kind of makes fun because, we think that, they were observing Passover in the wilderness. No, they weren't. Not if they weren't circumcised, they weren't. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That was a memorial that was instituted after they came into the land. Or Leviticus 23, and when you come into the land, okay, you're going to keep this day, the Sabbath you're going to keep. You're going to keep all my Sabbaths. And it goes through them, whether they're weekly or whether they're annual observances, okay? All right. So, do you see what Paul is drawing on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7:19? And this is very important because Moses, at the get-go, when he received the commandments of Yah, okay, which was already an established custom, circumcision and things like that, it's already an established custom in amongst the patriarchs and the Israelites and the fathers going all the way back to Abraham. Doesn't say anything about before Abraham, okay? That's another thing you got to understand. They weren't circumcised before Abraham to the covenant of Yahweh because there wasn't any. So stop with all this horse shit about dragging the Torah, Moses' law, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. There may have been dark shadows of precepts, but its embodiment and its content did not exist. Okay? And you do violence to the scripture when you try to impose pre-Diluvian and recent post-Diluvian customs and practices and try to make those as if they were Moses' law itself. Like the beginning of the year. This month shall be the beginning of months to you. Abib, 1. Okay? All right? Why would Yah have to tell somebody who had 300, 400, 500 years, 1,000 or 1,500 years of keeping the first day of the year, or the Yom Rishon, the first day of the year, or not Yom Rishon, let me get it here. I'm not a Hebrew expert, so maybe you ought to get a second opinion. Get a second opinion. Go ask Pete Rambo. He'll tell you. Anyway, and he'll quote the Hebrew phrase for that. Rosh Yair, I believe, is the new year. Okay? Hey, I pulled it out. Or at least I, mumbled it out. Anyway, so what's happening here is that they were going to be the inheritors of the covenant coming in to the land, and that they were going to, and then the covenant was confirmed, what he had promised to Abraham, but yet they had not fully received every blessing that's mentioned in Deuteronomy of keeping Yah's commandments and keeping his ways and his laws and his statutes and his judgments. He did not let all those people just live high on the hog because they had not yet even been tried yet. I mean, they got a lot of bad baggage from dad and grandpa going all the way back to Egypt. Okay? So, when they came into the land, they were tried. And Yah even told them that. He's not going to rid the land in a single day, because then the wild beasts would be multiplied against them. And he would also leave those people there to try them, to test them, to see whether they would walk in Yah's commandments or no. Okay? So, they were all circumcised at the Hill of Foreskins in Joshua, which is kind of really, in a way, if you don't see what's going on here with what Paul's talking about, with what Moses did with the tablets of stone, if you don't see that, you would come to the conclusion that Moses was asleep at the wheel when he commanded from Mount Sinai that every man be circumcised, every male be circumcised on the 8th day of his nativity. Okay? Moses gave a commandment and then, went fishing or went asleep at the wheel or one of these other, escapades, I don't know. Went to the Caribbean. I don't know where he went. But if you take that idea and you don't understand those concepts, then you would have to conclude that Moses was asleep at the wheel and that there is a polemic between the writings of Moses and the writings that are written in Joshua, whether they be their own hand writing it or one of their scribes.